The ring hit me square in the sternum, bounced off my very expensive borrowed tuxedo, and rolled under a shrimp cocktail table. That was how I found out I was dead, and also how I found out I was extremely catastrophically alive, just not as myself. James Calloway, William Ashford said, in the voice of a man who has rehearsed a sentence in front of a mirror, I am releasing you from our engagement. 200 of Chicago's wealthiest and most supernaturally overqualified guests went dead silent. Somewhere behind me, a string quartet actually stopped mid-bow, which I would later learn is a very expensive thing to make a string quartet do. I looked at the ring. I looked at the man. I looked at the ballroom of the Ashford Consortium's Winter's Assembly Gala, chandeliers like frozen waterfalls, a skyline of Lake Michigan glittering black and gold through floor-to-ceiling windows, 300 candles doing their absolute best impression of a fairy tale, and I thought, with the calm, distant clarity of a man watching his own house burn down from a safe hill, because I knew this scene. I had read this scene. Chapter 2, Alpha King's Obsessed Ex, posted every Tuesday and Friday on my phone at 2 in the morning back when I was a 29-year-old sous chef in Cleveland, with a bad back, a worse ex, and a habit of falling asleep to werewolf billionaire romance novels because my actual life did not have enough werewolves or billionaires in it. Apparently, my actual life had also not had enough grease fires, because the last thing I remembered before waking up in this ballroom, in this body, wearing James Calloway's very good cheekbones, was flames eating the ceiling tiles above the fryer station and shoving my line cook Marcus out from under a falling shelf with both hands. I did not remember hitting the ground. I remembered opening my eyes to find a man built like a skyscraper standing over me, holding a diamond ring like it had personally wronged him, and an entire ballroom holding its breath to watch me cry. I did not cry. Sorry, I said, crouching to retrieve the ring from beneath the shrimp table, with the brisk efficiency of a man who has dropped many things on many kitchen floors and simply picked them back up. Real quick, is this the part where I'm supposed to collapse? William Ashford blinked, twice. He was, I should mention, unfairly, almost insultingly handsome in the way book descriptions always undersell. 6'4" of tailored black wool, dark hair, a jaw you could set a level against, and eyes the pale gray of a lake right before a storm. 32 years old, according to the book's very thorough author's notes, CEO of the Ashford Consortium. And this is the part the guests all knew and I, freshly transmigrated, was still catching up on. The reigning Alpha King of the Assembly, which is what the 12 most powerful werewolf-adjacent bloodlines in North America called themselves when they wanted to sound important at a gala. You are not going to beg, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I was actually going to ask if the shrimp are still being passed, I said, standing, dusting off my knees, holding the ring out to him between two fingers like a maitre d' returning a dropped napkin. Because I skipped lunch preparing for the humiliation, and I have to say, so far, this is a pretty low-effort humiliation. You could have hired a skywriter. A sound went through the crowd, not laughter, not yet, more like 200 people simultaneously deciding it was safe to breathe. William did not take the ring. He was looking at me the way you look at a door that was supposed to be locked. You loved me, he said low, meant for just us, though acoustics in a room full of the extremely rich apparently don't care about your feelings. 2 years, and you loved me, and I am ending it in front of everyone, and you're making a joke about shrimp. Something flickered under the composure then, quick, almost embarrassed, like he hadn't meant to say the next part out loud. You stopped looking at me the way you used to, months ago. I told myself I imagined it. His jaw tightened. I don't think I did. I filed that away. It was, I would come to realize, the one true thing anyone had told me all night, and also the only piece of evidence, however small, however wrapped in a man's wounded pride, that somebody else's hands might be on the wheel of this particular disaster. Here is the thing I understood, standing there in a dead man's very good shoes. James Calloway, the original owner of this face, this title, this catastrophically well-tailored suit, had loved this man with the whole aching, undignified devotion of every romance novel side character who exists solely to be discarded in Chapter 2. I had read his whole arc. I knew where it went if I let it. Quiet devastation, a slow public unraveling, 3 chapters of crying in beautiful rooms, and then on page 200 and something, a small, sad off-page death that the actual hero and heroine, hero and other hero, this book had 2, barely noticed because James Calloway existed in this story for exactly one purpose: to make William Ashford's real love interest look better by comparison. I had cried actual tears over that character on my lunch break once, eating a cold sandwich in the walk-in fridge because it was the only quiet place in the restaurant. I was not going to become him. I didn't love you, I said, and it came out easier than I expected, because it was true. I hadn't, not one day of it, not one single Tuesday. James did, and James isn't available anymore. You'll have to take this up with him, and he's... I tapped my own sternum, right where the ring had hit. Currently indisposed. Somewhere near the ice sculpture, a man in a very good suit, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, holding a champagne flute like it was a prop in a play, only he knew the script too, made a sound like he'd swallowed a laugh wrong. William's jaw did something complicated. That doesn't make sense. Neither does throwing a ring at a man's chest at a party with 300 witnesses, I said. And yet... I set the ring down on the shrimp table, next to the cocktail sauce, with the specific gentle finality of a chef plating the last course of a meal nobody's going to finish. Then I turned around and walked toward the kitchen doors, because underneath the tuxedo and the transmigration and the werewolf politics, some things about me had not changed. And one of those things was that when my chest felt tight and my hands wanted somewhere to be useful, I went and found a stove. I heard, behind me, the specific sound of an entire room trying to figure out whether they'd just watched a scandal or a comedy. Frankly, so was I. Quick author's note, since we're already off to a chaotic start. If you're the kind of reader who needs to know whether the raccoons make it. They do, they're thriving, don't worry about them. Go ahead and hit follow now so you don't lose this one. It gets messier before it gets sweeter. Okay, back to the disaster. Somewhere in the part of my brain that was still catching up on the last 26 years of a stranger's life, James Calloway's memories sat quietly, patiently, like a filing cabinet somebody had left unlocked. I hadn't gone looking through it yet. I would eventually, out of necessity more than curiosity. You can't wear a man's face and answer to his name for the rest of your life without at least skimming the file. But in that first hour, walking away from a ballroom that smelled like candle wax and betrayal, all I let myself absorb was the shape of the thing. 2 years. An apartment above a bakery in Lincoln Park that had been quietly emptied the week the engagement was announced. A mother in Ohio he called every Sunday. A habit of leaving the porch light on for a man who almost never came home before midnight. It was, I thought, a genuinely sad little life. It deserved better than another 6 chapters of crying in beautiful rooms. So did I, frankly. I'd died saving a coworker from a falling shelf and woken up in someone else's body with someone else's heartbreak strapped to my back like a hand-me-down coat, 2 sizes too big. If the universe, or the author, or whoever was running this show, thought I was going to spend my one bonus life mourning a relationship I'd never actually been in, they had badly misjudged who they'd resurrected. I should say, for the record, that I am not, by nature, an industrious person. Back in Cleveland, on my one day off a week, my entire personality had been a couch, a bag of gas station sunflower seeds, and 4 straight hours of a cooking competition show I judged extremely harshly from a horizontal position. I did not iron things. I owned exactly 1 houseplant, and it was fake, and I still occasionally forgot to dust it. Whatever version of me you're picturing after that ballroom scene, brisk, competent, unbothered, please also picture that same man, 40 minutes later, lying flat on his back on a strange bed in a strange mansion, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, thinking, with total sincerity, I would very much like to take a nap before I process any of this, and then actually taking one for 2 hours, waking up only because someone very large was standing outside a very thin door. The Ashford Consortium's catering kitchen, tucked behind the ballroom through a service corridor lined with black and white photographs of Chicago's skyline through the decades, was in a state of quiet, controlled disaster when I pushed through the double doors, still in my tuxedo jacket. A sauce had broken. Not dramatically, nothing was on fire, nobody was screaming, but I clocked it from 6 feet away the way you clock a limp in someone's walk. The béarnaise on the back burner had gone from silk to grease, separated and sad, and the sous chef nearest it, a stocky man in his 50s with forearms like rope and the flat, unbothered face of someone who has survived 30 years of catering emergencies, was staring at it like it had personally insulted his mother. 2 younger cooks hovered near him, one gripping a fresh stick of butter, like it might solve the problem through proximity alone, the other very obviously calculating how many minutes remained before the soup course needed plating, regardless of whether the sauce cooperated. "Ice bath," I said, already rolling up my sleeves. "And a fresh yolk. You're not starting over, you're rescuing it." He looked at me, tuxedo, disheveled, clearly the guest from the very loud thing that had just happened 40 feet away through a wall, with the deep suspicion kitchen professionals reserve for anyone in a suit who thinks they know anything about a stove. "With respect," he said, "Sir, I don't think." "One yolk, room temp, whisk it separate, then add the broken sauce back in a thread, not a pour." I was already at the counter, already reaching for a bowl, my hands moving with a certainty that had nothing to do with James Calloway's memories and everything to do with 4 years of dinner service in a Cleveland kitchen that smelled permanently of garlic and regret. "Trust me. I used to do this for a living, a different living. Long story. There is a universal language spoken between people who have stood over a stove during a crisis, and it does not care what century, what body, or what tax bracket you're currently operating in." He watched my hands for exactly 4 seconds, made some internal calculation, and handed me the whisk. "Marcus," he said, by way of introduction, still watching the bowl instead of my face, the way people do when they're deciding whether to trust you. "Head of the kitchen here, 29 years. You?" "James," I said, "recently unemployed as a fiancé apparently. Long day, we saved the sauce." It took 90 seconds, and it was, honestly, the single most stable thing that had happened to me since I woke up in this life. "Not bad," Marcus said, which I would later learn was, from him, roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. "I have my moments," I said, and for the first time since the ring hit my chest, something in me unclenched. I stayed another 20 minutes, mostly out of habit, helping plate a course that had fallen behind, tasting a soup that needed more acid, showing a nervous line cook how to keep her knife from rocking so hard on the herbs. Nobody in that kitchen knew who I was to the party outside, or if they did, they had the professional grace not to mention it. For 20 minutes I was not James Calloway, tragic ex-fiancé of the Alpha King. I was just a guy who was good with a whisk, and if I'm being fully honest, also a guy who was privately, deeply relieved to have found the one room in this entire mansion where nobody expected him to have feelings about anything except sauce. Somewhere around the 4th plated dish, the nervous line cook, Angela, 22, 3 weeks into the job, and visibly terrified of everyone above her on the hierarchy, except, apparently, me, asked, very quietly, whether the rumors going around the service corridor were true, that the man who'd been dumped upstairs was down here fixing sauces in a tuxedo. "Depends which rumor," I said, plating a garnish. "If it's the one where I cried into the Béarnaise, that one's false. The Béarnaise and I have a strictly professional relationship." She laughed, surprised out of her nerves for a second, and went back to her herbs with slightly steadier hands, and I filed that away too, the specific useful discovery that making someone else laugh was a faster fix for my own chest than anything else I'd tried that night. I did not know, plating that last dish, that William Ashford had come looking for me, found the service corridor, and stood in the doorway for a full 3 minutes watching me work. Watching me laugh at something the nervous line cook said, watching me correct Marcus's seasoning with the easy confidence of someone entirely, unfamiliarly sure of himself, before turning around and walking away without a word. I found out about it later. From the man with the champagne flute, who turned out to be Oliver Bennett, William's cousin and chief of staff, who told me with the specific delight of a man who loves nothing more than watching his cousin lose an argument he didn't know he was having. He said, "Oliver told me, 3 days later, over a coffee I hadn't asked for and he'd brought anyway, dropping into the one chair on my porch like he'd been invited, which he hadn't, and I quote, 'I don't understand what I just saw.' Then he went to his office and didn't come out for 2 hours. William Ashford, Alpha King, heir to $4 billion and at least one throne-adjacent title, was rattled by a man whisking eggs. "It's a good whisk technique," I said. "It's not the whisk technique, sweetheart," Oliver said, and grinned like a cat who'd found the good treats. I got the rest of the story about that particular engagement, the way I got most things in those first few weeks, sideways, in fragments, from people who assumed I already knew. 2 years ago, apparently, William had needed a fiancé the way other men need a stapler, functionally, urgently, and with as little emotional consideration as possible. The assembly, the loose, ancient council of the 12 strongest pack lineages in North America, who met twice a year in rooms with too much mahogany to discuss things like territory and succession, and apparently marriage, did not entirely trust an alpha king who wasn't bonded. Something about stability. Something about optics. William had been 30, freshly installed after his father's retirement, and drowning in a boardroom's worth of old men who didn't think he was ready. James Calloway had been a graduate student at Northwestern at the time, studying art conservation, sweet-faced and soft-spoken, and this part I got from a woman who knocked on my door the following Tuesday holding a mug of coffee she hadn't been asked to bring, 24 years old, sharp-eyed, an Omega who worked the estate as a junior housekeeper, and had, it turned out, been there even then, the kind of person who apologized to furniture when he bumped into it. William met him at a fundraiser, decided within the week that here was a solution to his optics problem, who also happened to be, undeniably, easy to look at, and proposed with the efficient, joyless clarity of a man closing a business deal. He never stood a chance, I said, once she'd told me the shape of it, sitting on my porch step with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between us. Her name was Rosa Delgado, and she had the specific, unimpressed honesty of someone who had grown up around people with money and had decided, early, not to be dazzled by any of them. Neither of them did. William didn't know how to want someone the normal way, and James didn't know how to want anything for himself at all. "And you?" Rosa asked, watching me with the particular sharp gentleness she used when she already suspected the answer. "I know exactly how to want things," I said. "I just haven't decided yet if I want any of this." That was, if I'm honest, already a lie by the time I said it. I'd decided somewhere around the Béarnais. Rosa was the one who'd found me that morning, standing in front of a lopsided shelf in the guest cottage I'd been quietly relocated to. The polite fiction being that James Calloway needed space to process, the actual fact being that nobody in the main house knew what to do with the ex-fiancé who wouldn't cry, attempting repairs with a butter knife because it was the only tool I could find. "You're doing that wrong," she'd said, in a tone of such flat honesty that I'd liked her immediately, and handed me the coffee without being asked. "I'm aware," I said. "I don't suppose the estate has a real toolkit somewhere that isn't guarded by a man with a title. I'll find you one," she said, and did that same afternoon, and did not ask a single question about the gala, the ring, or the ballroom, which, after a week of every single other person in my orbit tiptoeing around it like it was a bomb, felt like the nicest thing anyone had done for me in 2 lifetimes. The cottage sat at the far edge of the Ashford estate, past the rose garden, close enough to Lake Michigan that on quiet mornings I could hear the water without seeing it. It was smaller than the guest wing of the main house, which suited me fine. I'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Parma, Ohio, and 4,000 square feet of marble had never once felt like mine. I fixed the shelf myself, once Rosa's toolkit arrived. I fixed the sticky kitchen drawer and the porch light that buzzed, and I found in the back of a cabinet a chipped mug shaped like a fat little owl that nobody wanted, and claimed it, and used super glue and a strip of gold leaf I found in a craft drawer to mend the crack in a way that made it, if anything, better than new. I planted herbs in the window box, basil, thyme, a stubborn rosemary that took 2 tries, and started slowly, without really meaning to, building a life that had nothing to do with any king. I should note that this made-for-television burst of competence had a very short battery life. The 3 trunks of James Calloway's old belongings that Rosa had quietly moved into my 2nd bedroom sat there, unopened, for a full month, because unpacking somebody else's heartbreak sounded, frankly, like a chore, and I have never in either of my lives met a chore I didn't try to outlast through sheer stubborn avoidance first. A stack of assembly paperwork about my transitional status sat on the counter gathering actual dust for 3 weeks before Rosa finally sat me down and filled half of it out herself, muttering the entire time about men who could fix a mailbox blindfolded but couldn't fill out a single government form. I am, deep down, still a man who will absolutely alphabetize a spice rack before he will answer an email, and this life, it turned out, had plenty of both. Rosa, for her part, found this endlessly diagnosable. "You'll rewire a lamp," she told me once, watching me avoid a very simple phone call to the Assembly's records office for the 3rd consecutive day. "Before you'll dial a number. It's a whole personality. It's a coping mechanism," I said. "There's a difference. Is there though, she said, and did not wait for an answer, and I did not have one ready anyway. William started showing up on the third day. The first time, he knocked. I didn't answer. I could hear him standing there through the door. I have excellent hearing now. One of the stranger perks of inhabiting a body with a little wolf in the blood. For 11 minutes before he said, to the closed door, in a voice with all the natural authority sanded off it, I brought food. I have food. I called back, from the kitchen, where I was in fact making food, the smell of garlic and browning butter, probably doing more to undercut my point than I would have liked. It's from the estate kitchen, Marcus made it specifically. I know Marcus. I trust Marcus's cooking completely. I don't trust the part where it's sitting on a tray you personally carried across the lawn as an apology gift, which means it's not food, it's a guilt offering, and guilt offerings taste like guilt no matter what's under the lid. There was a long pause. Then, very quietly, almost too quiet for even Wolf hearing, William said, That's a strangely specific metaphor. I used to work in a restaurant, I said, which was true, and also not remotely an answer, and also the most I was willing to explain that day. He left the tray on the porch anyway. I gave it to the raccoons, who, unlike certain alpha kings, did not require an apology to accept a free meal. He came back the next day with no tray. Just himself, hands in his coat pockets, standing at the bottom of the porch steps like a man who had rehearsed something and forgotten all of it the moment the door opened. No food today, I asked, leaning in the doorway, because if I was going to have this conversation, I was at least going to enjoy it a little. I thought you'd find that suspicious too, smart man. I crossed my arms. Behind me, on the stove, a pot of stock I'd started that morning was just beginning to smell like something worth finishing. What do you actually want, Ashford? I don't know what happened to you, he said, and there it was, the real question, the one under all the others, the one that had apparently been eating at him since a kitchen doorway 3 days ago. You're not acting like yourself. Maybe I finally am, as I said. You just never met him before. His storm gray eyes did something complicated, something that might, on a less controlled man, have looked almost like fear. I want to understand you. That's going to be a whole project, I said. I hope you cleared your schedule. I hear you run a company and a small werewolf government, so you know. Pencil me in. The corner of his mouth twitched, actually twitched upward, a full half-inch of a smile he clearly hadn't authorized his own face to make. It vanished almost as fast as it came, replaced by the careful blankness of a man who has spent his whole life being watched and has learned not to give the room anything for free. But I saw it. And something about seeing it, the crack in $4 billion worth of composure, over a joke about his own schedule, made my chest do something warm and traitorous that I chose, firmly, to ignore. I'll earn it, he said. Quiet, certain. The voice I would learn, that he used for things he meant all the way down. Good, I said, and closed the door, gently, not a slam, because, and this surprised me as much as anyone, I found I didn't actually want to hurt him. I just wasn't going to make it easy. Through the window, I watched him stand in the yard for another full minute before he left, hands still in his pockets, head tipped back toward the lake like he was listening to something only he could hear. He came back 3 more times that week, and each time it was smaller than the last. Not less determined, just less performative, like a man slowly figuring out that the grand gestures he'd been raised on didn't actually work on someone who couldn't be impressed by a checkbook. The second visit, he fixed my mailbox, which I hadn't asked him to and hadn't mentioned was crooked, and did not bring it up afterward, just did it while I was inside and left before I came back out, so that I found it standing straight and level with no explanation attached, like evidence left at a crime scene by someone who wanted to be caught but not questioned. The third visit, he brought nothing at all, sat on the porch step at a careful, respectful distance, and asked me, actually asked, waited for the answer instead of filling the silence the way Oliver said he used to, what Cleveland was like. I told him about the restaurant. Not the fire, not yet, but the rest of it. The 80-hour weeks, the burn scars up my left forearm that James Calloway's smooth, unmarked skin didn't have, and that I found myself, for one disorienting week, checking for every morning out of habit. I told him about the walk-in fridge where I used to hide on bad shifts, about my mother's Sunday phone calls, real ones this time, mine, not James's borrowed Ohio. He listened like it mattered. He didn't try to fix any of it, didn't offer to buy me a restaurant or solve poverty retroactively the way I half expected a man like him to. He just listened, elbows on his knees, storm-gray eyes steady on the lake instead of on me, giving me room to talk without the pressure of being watched while I did it. "You died," he said finally quietly, not a question. Somewhere in my rambling I must have let the truth slip sideways, the way it does when you talk long enough to someone who isn't interrupting. Before this life, you actually died. Saving a line cook named Marcus, weirdly enough, not the Marcus you know, a different one, from a falling shelf during a grease fire. I turned my coffee mug in my hands. It's a stupid way to go. I think about it sometimes. Whether it was worth it, was it? He walked his daughter down the aisle 8 months later, I said. So yeah, I think it was. William didn't say anything for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way I hadn't heard from him before. Not performance, not composure, just a man saying something true. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "I know that's a strange thing to be glad about, given the circumstances, but I am." "Careful," I said, because the moment had gotten dangerously close to sincere and I wasn't ready, not yet, to let it stay there. That almost sounded like feelings. "God forbid," he said, and something in his face loosened, the crack in his composure spreading a little wider this time, and I decided, watching him, that I liked him considerably more than was strategically wise. I put both hands flat on my kitchen counter and took a slow breath. Oh no, I thought. I like him. I like him even though I know how this book goes. Except, I reminded myself, stirring the stock, watching steam curl toward the window box, where the basil was finally, stubbornly thriving. I didn't know how this book went anymore, because this time I wasn't following the script. This time, if anything happened between us, it was going to happen because I let it, on my terms, in my kitchen, with my rules. That felt, for the first time since I woke up in a stranger's very expensive shoes, like power. Grayson Vale arrived at the estate the following week with 4 matching suitcases, an assistant named Priya who looked perpetually exhausted, and the specific bright, brittle charm of a man who has never once in his life doubted that a room would rearrange itself around him. He was 29, an Omega, heir to a mid-tier pack fortune, and as it turned out, the architect of the entire James Calloway is cold and unloving narrative that had convinced William, over months of carefully forged texts and one extremely well-timed staged photograph, that his fiancée had stopped caring. Grayson had wanted William's title, William's company, and, mostly I suspected, watching him work a room at his welcome dinner like a man auditioning for a play only he could see, the specific, delicious feeling of being chosen over somebody. I noticed Priya before I noticed anything else about that welcome dinner. She stood a half step behind Grayson's chair the entire meal, refilling his water before he asked, and every time he snapped his fingers for her attention, actually snapped them, like she was a waiter at a restaurant that had personally wronged him. Something flickered across her face too fast to be anything but exhaustion wearing thin. At one point he handed her his phone under the table without looking at her and said low, "Delete anything from before this week," and she took it without a word, but her jaw tightened in a way that made me think, even then, on day one, that Grayson Vale had built his entire scheme on the assumption that the people closest to him would never get tired enough to stop protecting him. I filed that away too. It seemed, even then, like the kind of assumption that eventually runs out of road. Later that same evening, refilling my glass on her way past, a task that wasn't hers, since I wasn't the one who'd hired her, Priya paused for half a second longer than the job required, and said quietly to no one in particular, "Some people mistake being needed for being wanted. It's a very expensive mistake to keep making for somebody else." Then she moved on to the next glass before I could decide whether I'd imagined it, and I understood, watching her go, that whatever was happening behind Grayson Vale's bright, brittle charm, it had an audience who was taking very careful notes. He found me in the estate's east garden 2 days after he arrived, where I was on my knees in the dirt, elbow deep in a rosemary bush that had staged a small rebellion against its trellis. "James," he said, in the sweet, sympathetic tone of a woman in a soap opera about to say something devastating, "I just want you to know, I never meant for it to go this far." "For what to go this far?" I asked, not looking up, because I already knew. I'd read this exact scene in Chapter 4, back when I was eating a cold sandwich in a walk-in fridge feeling sorry for a fictional man I hadn't yet realized I would become. The engagement, William and I, we didn't plan to fall for each other, it just happened. He pressed a hand to his chest like the words cost him something. I hope in time you can forgive us. I sat back on my heels, wiped dirt off my hands onto my jeans, and looked at him. Really looked, the way you look at a dish that's been plated beautifully but smells slightly off underneath the garnish. Grayson, I said, you've been on this estate for 2 days. I have been dumped for exactly 9 of them. Do the math on how fast this alleged love story is supposedly happening, and then tell me again with a straight face that this isn't a plan. His smile flickered, just slightly. Like a light on a bad circuit. I don't know what you're implying, he said. I'm not implying anything, I said, standing, brushing off my knees. I'm just very, very good at reading recipes, and this one has your fingerprints all over the ingredient list. I picked up my trowel. Enjoy the garden, Grayson. The rosemary bites. It didn't, literally. But the look on his face when he stepped backward into the very thorny rosebush behind him, right on cue, like the garden itself had opinions, was, I will admit, deeply satisfying, and I did not apologize, and neither, notably, did the roses. Here is a thing that happened slowly, over the 6 weeks that followed. In 100 small moments, I didn't fully clock his courtship, until I was several dishes deep into it. William started showing up at the cottage not with trays, but with ingredients. A bag of Michigan peaches from a farmer's market in Evanston. A jar of local honey. Once, memorably, an entire box of fresh pasta flour because I'd mentioned, once in passing, that I missed making noodles from scratch and hadn't found good semolina in Illinois. He didn't cook. He stood in my small kitchen doorway, too big for it, always slightly in the way, a man built for boardrooms trying to fold himself into a space meant for one person and a stand mixer, and watched, and handed me things when I asked, and once, when I turned around too fast with a hot pan, caught my elbow to steady me with a hand that stayed exactly as long as it needed to and not 1 second more. You're careful, I said, that day, surprised. Careful was not a word the book had ever used about William Ashford. The book's William threw rings at people. I'm learning to be, he said, and there was something in his voice, low and a little rough, that made me want to change the subject immediately. So I did, loudly, about the difference between semolina and all-purpose flour, and he let me, and stayed for dinner anyway, sitting on the one stool in my kitchen that fit him, eating fresh pasta with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, looking more like a person and less like a title than I had ever seen him. Tell me something, I said, twirling noodles, watching him across the small counter. In 2 years with James, the real one, the original, did you ever once sit in a kitchen like this? He was quiet for a long moment. No, he said, I don't think I ever asked him what he wanted. I decided what I thought he should want, and gave him that instead, and called it love because it was expensive. That's not love, I said gently, because it wasn't cruelty. It was just true, the way a burnt roux is just true. No judgment in the fact, just information. That's a really nice apology gift habit. I know that now. He looked at me, steady, storm-gray eyes catching the low kitchen light. I don't know how to be the other thing, but I'd like you to teach me, if you'll let me stay long enough to learn. Something in my chest went warm and unhelpful again, and I did not stir it away with more pasta talk, because some feelings I was learning deserved to just be felt instead of cooked around. Pass the Parmesan, I said instead, because I am, apparently, a coward with excellent comedic timing, and he laughed, actually laughed, a real one, low and surprised out of him like it hadn't been used in years, and passed the Parmesan, and our fingers brushed on the handoff, and neither of us pulled away. He stayed until almost midnight that night, long after the pasta was gone, long after any reasonable excuse for lingering had expired, sitting on his too small stool asking increasingly specific questions about Cleveland, what the restaurant smelled like at 6 a.m., before the ovens were on, whether I'd had a favorite regular, whether the couch and the sunflower seeds and the cooking show I judged harshly from a horizontal position were a permanent arrangement or a phase. I told him it was a lifestyle, not a phase, and he said, with the particular gravity of a man rearranging his worldview in real time, that he found that oddly reassuring, and I decided not to examine too closely why that landed somewhere so soft in my chest. A young alpha named Theo, visiting from a Pacific Northwest pack, with an unfairly good smile and the easy charm of someone who had never once been told no, cornered me at a smaller estate function about a week into all this, asking, with a directness I appreciated even as I recognized exactly what he was doing, whether the rumors about the ex-fiancé situation were as messy as everyone said, and whether I'd like to get a coffee sometime and compare notes on surviving assembly politics. I hadn't even gotten to answer. William had appeared at my elbow with the swift, silent efficiency of a man who had apparently developed a sixth sense specifically tuned to Theo's voice, said something polite and utterly glacial about hoping Theo enjoyed the rest of the visit, and steered me toward the dessert table with a hand at the small of my back that was, technically, not possessive at all, and also somehow extremely possessive. "You didn't have to do that," I told him later, back at the cottage, watching him pace my small kitchen with the barely restrained energy of a man who wanted to say something and was working very hard not to. "I know," he said. "You could have let me answer. I know that too. So why?" "Because I don't like it," he said, stopping, turning to face me fully, jaw tight in a way I recognize now as him being honest rather than angry. "I have no right to." "We are not. I have not earned the right to feel what I felt watching him talk to you. But I felt it anyway, and I would rather admit it badly than pretend I didn't." I looked at him for a long moment, my brand new, badly behaved, gloriously transparent almost something, and felt something in my chest go soft and unguarded in a way I hadn't quite let it since the ballroom. "For the record," I said, "I wasn't going to get coffee with him." "I know that too," he admitted, sheepish now, some of the tension draining out of his shoulders. "It didn't stop the feeling." "Good," I said, surprising us both. "Feel it a little longer. It's a good look on you. Humbling. You're enjoying this." "Immensely," I said, and he laughed, finally, the tightness gone out of him entirely. The teasing started properly a few days after that, which is also, not coincidentally, around the time I stopped pretending to myself that I minded him being underfoot in my kitchen. "You're doing that on purpose," I told him one evening, watching him attempt, badly, deliberately badly, I was almost certain, to dice an onion. "Doing what?" "Being bad at this, so I have to come stand next to you and fix it." He didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. "Is it working?" "Scoot," I said, elbowing him half a step sideways, close enough that his arm pressed warm against mine, close enough that I could smell cedar and something clean underneath it that was distinctly, maddeningly him. I put my hand over his on the knife, adjusted his grip, curled his fingers back from the blade. "Claw grip, like this." "Like this," he repeated, and did not, I noticed, actually improve, and I did not, I noticed, actually mind standing there another 5 minutes, correcting a billionaire's onion technique with my hand over his and my heart doing something entirely unprofessional against my ribs. "You're hopeless," I said. "I'm motivated," he said, and turned his head, and we were close enough that I could count individual gray flecks in his eyes, close enough that the kitchen went very, very quiet, except for the sound of onions we had both, entirely, forgotten about. He didn't kiss me. Not that night. He stepped back first, cleared his throat, said something about a call he had to take, and left with his ears faintly, satisfyingly red, and I stood in my kitchen alone laughing at absolutely nothing, delighted, undone, thoroughly and completely in trouble. The Saturday after the onion incident, he showed up at 7 in the morning in jeans. Actual jeans, the first time I'd ever seen him in anything that wasn't tailored within an inch of its life, and asked, with the stiff, over-rehearsed formality of a man who had clearly practiced the sentence in his car, if I would like to accompany him to the farmer's market in Evanston. "Is this a date?" I asked, arms crossed in my doorway, "or a business meeting with produce?" "I genuinely don't know," he admitted. "I've never done this before. Taken someone somewhere just because I wanted to, and not because it served a purpose. That might be the saddest sentence I've ever heard a billionaire say. I'm aware." "Get in the car," I said, before I change my mind and go back to bed instead, which, for the record, was very much on the table. The market ran along a shaded block near the lake, stalls of early peaches and greenhouse tomatoes, and a bakery table that made William stop dead in front of it, like he'd walked into a wall, and it was, against every expectation I'd built up about a man who owned 3 separate skyscrapers, the single least ostentatious 2 hours I spent that whole spring. He didn't get recognized, or if he did, nobody said anything. And he carried the tote bags without being asked and let me haggle over peaches, even though I strongly suspect he could have bought the entire orchard outright. And somewhere between the honey stand and the flower stall he reached over, without ceremony, without a speech, and took my hand. I let him. We didn't talk about it. That was, I think, the whole point. He'd learned, finally, that not every gesture needed a toast attached to it. We just walked, his hand warm and a little too careful around mine, like he expected me to pull away and was bracing gently for it, and I didn't, and somewhere around the cheese vendor I laced my fingers properly through his, and felt him exhale, actually exhale, the way you do when you've been holding your breath without noticing. "This is nice," he said, eventually, like the observation had surprised him. "Ordinary things usually are," I said. "You should try them more often." "I hear the King's discount doesn't apply to farmers' markets." "Noted," he said, and squeezed my hand, and bought entirely too many peaches, and I did not, notably, complain about a single one of them. Grayson tried a different tack the following week, at a smaller family dinner. Just the inner circle, or the closest thing the assembly had to it, a monthly ritual of roast chicken and thinly veiled political maneuvering. He cornered me by the sideboard while everyone else was still finding their seats. "You could leave," he said, low, refilling my wine without asking like it was a kindness. "Take a settlement. William would give you anything to make this go quietly, a restaurant of your own, somewhere far from here, no more pretending to fit into a world you clearly don't belong in." He smiled, sweet as spoiled milk. "Wouldn't that be easier? For everyone?" For one unguarded second, I actually considered it, not because I wanted to leave, but because some tired, transmigrated part of me recognized the shape of the offer, the specific relief of being told you're allowed to stop trying. I'd spent one whole life exhausting myself for people who never noticed. It would have been so easy to take the money and the quiet and go open a diner somewhere with good pie and no werewolves at all. Then I thought about the porch step and the crooked mailbox fixed without a word, and a man in jeans standing stunned in front of a bakery table like joy was a foreign language he was only just starting to learn, and I put my wine glass down, gently, deliberately, the way you set down something you've decided not to break. "Here's the thing, Grayson," I said. "I've already died once for the wrong reasons. I'm not about to leave for the wrong ones too." "That's very dramatic for a man who fixes his own mailbox," Grayson said, recovering fast, reaching for something cutting. "I contain multitudes," I said. "Also a very good pie crust recipe, which you're never getting, because you tried to buy me off with a hypothetical restaurant instead of just admitting you're bad at scheming. Pass the potatoes." He passed the potatoes. His hand was shaking, just slightly, and I understood, watching it, that some part of him already knew the ending was coming, that a scheme built on making someone feel small only works on someone who still believes they're supposed to be. I hadn't believed that in a long time. Grayson's scheme fell apart at the Ashford Consortium's spring fundraiser, 3 weeks later, in front of roughly 400 witnesses and one extremely ill-advised live stream. He'd planned, we found out afterward, to have Priya plant a forged letter in my coat pocket, supposedly proof I'd been secretly negotiating with a rival pack behind William's back, time to be discovered during his own toast to the Ashford family's generosity. What Grayson had not accounted for was Priya herself. She'd been quietly documenting every instruction he gave her for weeks by then. I found out later she'd started the same week I noticed the phone incident in the garden, the same week his fingers had snapped over her head one too many times, and had spent that same week forwarding every incriminating text, voice memo, and half-finished forged letter to Oliver, who had spent that same week quietly building a folder titled, with characteristic restraint, Receipts. So when Grayson stood up at the podium, champagne in hand, and launched into his toast, "To the Ashford family, who taught me that love isn't about who you're given, it's about who you choose," Oliver simply walked to the projector at the side of the ballroom, plugged in his laptop, and put the entire folder up on the screen behind Grayson's head. Text after text, voice memo transcripts. A photo of the forged letter, mid-construction, complete with 3 crossed-out drafts because apparently forgery is harder than it looks. The room went dead silent, in that specific way it did whenever the Ashford family had feelings in public. Grayson turned around, saw his own handwriting projected 12 feet tall behind him, and made a sound like a kettle starting to boil. That's taken out of context." "Which part?" Oliver said pleasantly. "The part where you call it Operation Swap, or the part where you spelled inheritance wrong 3 times. I will admit, I did not help. I stood near the dessert table with a plate of the little lemon tarts I'd personally consulted on with Marcus that week, and watched Grayson's 400 guest audience turn, in real time, from admiring to appalled, and felt not one drop of guilt about enjoying it. He left that night, suitcases and all, with the specific speed of a man who has realized the whole building now has his number, and this part I only heard secondhand, got recognized 3 days later at a bar in the West Loop by someone who'd watched a clip of the whole thing go viral under the caption "Rich People Problems," and was asked loudly, in front of a full happy hour crowd, if he'd found any good inheritances lately, which is, I think, exactly the kind of low-grade, non-violent, extremely deserved comeuppance a man like Grayson Vale earns in this life. Priya, for her part, got a formal apology from William, a genuinely excellent reference letter, and, at her own request, delivered with a straight face that suggested she'd been waiting months to say it. Grayson's old corner office, which she now uses, by all accounts, to run half the consortium's philanthropic arm considerably better than he ever ran anything. William found me by the dessert table afterward, tie slightly crooked, the ghost of an actual grin still on his face, the first time I'd ever seen him look, in public, entirely unguarded. "You knew," he said, "about him from the start." "I read the book," I said, then caught myself, because that was a very large piece of information to hand a man over lemon tarts. "I mean, I had a feeling. You've had a lot of feelings that turned out to be exactly right," he said, watching me with an expression I was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was doing math on something and didn't yet trust the answer he was getting. "About Grayson, about the ring, about me. I'm very intuitive," I said. "It's a gift." "James," he said my name, the name I'd kept, the name that had stopped, somewhere in the last 2 months, feeling like borrowed clothing and started feeling like mine. "I need to say something, and I need you to let me get through it before you make a joke, because I know you, and I know you make jokes exactly when things get too real to hold." "No promises," I said, "but go ahead." "I threw a ring at you," he said, "in front of everyone. I let a stranger convince me, over months, that the person who was kindest to me was actually cruelest, because it was easier to believe a lie that confirmed what I already feared, that I wasn't someone worth staying for, than to trust the truth in front of me." "Are we doing the whole speech?" I asked, "or can I eat my tart while you finish?" I multitask well under emotional duress. "Eat your tart," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching despite himself, and kept going anyway, steadier for the interruption, the way people sometimes are. "I have spent 2 months watching you fix things in a cottage I could have rebuilt for you in a week, watching you be careful with a raccoon's dinner and careless with your own heart, and I understood, somewhere around the pasta flour, that I wasn't trying to win you back because I was lonely. I was trying to win you back because you are, without any exaggeration, the best thing that has happened to this family in a generation, and I would like—" His composure cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, the way it did in kitchen doorways and porch steps and nowhere else, for no one else. "I would like to spend the rest of however long you'll let me, earning the second chance I clearly do not deserve." I looked at him for a long moment, at the storm-gray eyes, at the loosened tie, at the man who'd learned, over 2 months of onions and pasta flour, how to stand still enough in a kitchen doorway to let someone else's whole life happen around him without needing to control it. "You still owe me a working knife grip," I said finally, "because some feelings deserve a joke first and the truth second, and this was one of them. And an apology to the raccoons. They liked that tray more than I did." "Anything," he said, and meant it, the way he meant the things he said in that particular register. "Then yes," I said, "you can earn it. I'll even supervise." He kissed me then, finally, right there by the dessert table, one hand warm at my jaw, careful, unhurried, tasting faintly of champagne and entirely, overwhelmingly, like a decision neither of us regretted. And somewhere near the projector, Oliver Bennett said, to no one in particular, finally, with the exhausted satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for this exact plot point since Chapter 1. He proposed properly 3 months later, which is to say, badly, adorably, with none of the polish $4 billion usually buys. On the porch step, at dusk, mid-sentence about a shipment of tomatoes, Ringbox fished awkwardly out of his jacket, like he'd been carrying it around for a week working up the nerve, which Oliver later confirmed he had. "I had a whole speech," William admitted, kneeling on the same porch step where he'd once sat asking me about Cleveland, the ring, a plain gold band, nothing like the diamond that had once bounced off my sternum, chosen, he said, because he wanted this one to mean something the other never had, trembling slightly in his hand. I wrote it and rewrote it for a week. I can't remember a single word of it now. Improvise, I said, my own heart going embarrassingly fast for a man who already knew what he was going to say. James Calloway, he said. My name, the one I'd chosen to keep, the one that was mine now in every way that mattered. I'd like to spend the rest of my life learning your knife grip and losing every single argument about salt. Marry me. Not because the assembly needs stability, not because it would look good at a gala. Because I want to. That's a low bar, I said, laughing, crying a little, both at once. You already lose every argument about salt. I know, he said. Marry me anyway. Yes, I said, and he stood up too fast and nearly knocked us both off the porch step, and I decided, laughing into his shoulder while the raccoons watched from the tree line, with what I chose to interpret as approval, that this was, without any competition, the best ending I had ever gotten to choose for myself. We got married the following spring, on the lawn behind the cottage, because I refused, flatly, immovably refused, to get married in the ballroom where a diamond ring had once left a bruise on my chest, and William, to his enormous credit, did not argue, just quietly had the entire event move to face the lake instead. The morning of, I nearly talked myself out of the whole enterprise, not from nerves about William, but from a sudden overwhelming urge to just stay in bed reading a book instead, a very specific flavor of pre-event dread I recognized immediately as the same thing that used to keep me from RSVPing to anything back in Cleveland. Rosa caught me still in pajamas 40 minutes before I was supposed to be dressed, staring at the ceiling with a paperback open on my chest that I had not, in fact, been reading. Absolutely not, she said, and physically confiscated the book. You do not get to have your one lazy morning today, of all days. Up, I was building momentum. You were hiding, she said, not unkindly, hauling me upright by the wrist, which frankly I understand, but the man downstairs has been standing in the yard since 6 a.m., rehearsing vows to a rosebush, so I'm going to need you to go be brave at him now and nap tomorrow. I went. I was admittedly glad she made me. Rosa did my boutonniere, muttering the whole time about how she was not, under any circumstances, going to cry, and then cried anyway, loudly, unapologetically, halfway through pinning the flowers. Marcus catered, and cried into the creme brulee, and denied it fiercely to anyone who asked, though several guests reported seeing him dab his eyes with an oven mitt he'd apparently brought for exactly that purpose. Oliver gave a best man's toast that somehow involved 3 separate references to onion dicing technique, and made 200 guests, several of them extremely important werewolf-adjacent dignitaries who had spent decades cultivating reputations for terrifying stoicism, laugh until they had to set down their champagne. To James, Oliver finished, raising his glass, who walked into this family sideways, through a kitchen, and somehow ended up being the best thing that ever happened to it. William, buddy, you don't deserve him. Try to earn it daily anyway. I intend to, William said from beside me, not looking away from my face even once. At the altar, in a suit that fit him the way nothing had fit him in that ballroom the first night, like a man instead of a title, he looked at me the way you look at something you built with your own hands and can't quite believe held. Any final jokes, he murmured, low, just for me, as the officiant cleared her throat. Before I make this permanent, just one, I said. I'm told the honeymoon includes a kitchen. If it's smaller than the cottage, this whole marriage is off. He laughed, right there, at the altar, in front of 400 people and one deeply relieved string quartet, and I decided, watching him laugh with his whole unguarded face, that I would happily spend the rest of however long I got in this borrowed, chosen, entirely mine life making this particular man laugh at altars, over onions, through closed doors, for as long as he'd let me. He let me for a very, very long time. You're doing it wrong, I said, from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching my husband. My husband, a word I still occasionally said out loud just to feel it land. Attempt to make my grandmother's stock recipe from a note card I'd left on the counter as a joke, and which he had apparently taken with the deadly seriousness of a man closing a 9-figure acquisition. I am following the instructions exactly as written, William said, not looking up, sleeves rolled, one smudge of flour on his jaw that I was choosing, for the moment, not to mention. The instructions say a pinch of salt. You added what I can only describe as a fistful. The card didn't specify fist size. Nobody's card specifies fist size, William. That's implied by centuries of cooking wisdom. I run a $4 billion consortium and preside over the assembly of North American PACs, he said, with the particular dignity of a man defending an indefensible soup, and I refuse to be lectured on salt measurements by a man who once described a raccoon as more trustworthy than most CEOs. That raccoon has never once thrown a ring at me, I said, crossing the kitchen, taking the wooden spoon gently out of his hand, tasting the soup, wincing dramatically enough that he actually laughed. This is unsalvageable. We're starting over. Together? Obviously together. You'd set off the smoke alarm alone within 4 minutes. 3 historically, he said, already reaching for a fresh pot, already rolling his sleeves higher. I should mention, in the interest of full honesty, that I had absolutely no intention of helping with the second attempt either, not really. I'd fully planned to supervise from the stool with a glass of wine while he did the actual dicing, which is, if you ask me, a perfectly reasonable division of labor between a man who cooked professionally in one life and a man who is still, 6 months into marriage, aggressively bad at reading a recipe card. William, to his credit, had stopped falling for the supervise from the stool trick around month 3 and simply handed me a knife anyway, which is how I ended up back at the cutting board, mildly annoyed about it, entirely unable to actually mind. Rosa knocked twice and let herself in without waiting for an answer, took one look at the ruined stock, at the flour on William's jaw, at the two of us bickering happily over a wooden spoon, and said, with the flat, fond exasperation of someone who had genuinely stopped being surprised by any of this months ago, "I'm not even going to ask." "Wise," I said. "Stay for dinner," William said, once we started over. Properly this time. "With actual measured salt," I added. "With actual measured salt," he agreed, bumping my shoulder with his. Rosa stayed. So did Marcus, who wandered over an hour later under the transparent pretense of checking the estate's herb garden, took one taste of our second attempt at the stock, and admitted, grudgingly, the way a man admits defeat in a game he still insists he could win on a rematch, that it wasn't bad. Oliver showed up sometime after that with a bottle of wine nobody had asked for, and a story about a board meeting that had apparently devolved into a genuine shouting match over parking allocation, which he told with such theatrical outrage that William, mid-sip, actually choked on his wine and had to be thumped on the back, laughing too hard to properly recover his dignity, which by this point in the evening none of us particularly cared about anyway. Somewhere between the second bottle of wine and Marcus's third grudging compliment about the stock, Oliver produced, with the flourish of a man who had clearly been saving it, a framed photograph he'd apparently had printed specially. The exact moment from the wedding when William had tripped slightly, stepping up to the altar, and I had grabbed his sleeve to steady him, both of us laughing before a single vow had even been said. "I'm hanging this in the front hall," Oliver announced, "where every future assembly delegate can see it and understand exactly what kind of king they're dealing with now." "Absolutely not," William said, with no actual conviction whatsoever. "It's already framed, William." "Then I suppose," William said, "there's nothing to be done," and reached for it anyway, turning it over in his hands with an expression far too fond for a man pretending to be annoyed, and set it, that same night, on the mantel in the cottage, where it has stayed ever since, slightly crooked, because neither of us has ever quite gotten around to fixing that either. It struck me, sometime around dessert, watching my husband argue cheerfully with his cousin about whether the assembly's next gala should serve the little lemon tarts again. William, absurdly, passionately, in favor. Oliver arguing on principle alone, because agreeing with William on the first pass had apparently never once been his personality, that this was the part no romance novel ever really bothers to write. Not the ring, not the rejection, not even the grand tearful reconciliation under twinkling lights. Just this. A kitchen too small for a king, a stock that had needed a second attempt, a raccoon-proof porch light buzzing faithfully on schedule, and a table full of people who had all, in their own strange way, chosen to stay. I'd read a version of this story once, back when I still had a body of my own and a bad back and a walk-in fridge to hide in on hard nights. In that version, the man wearing my name now had died quietly on page 200 and something, off-page, barely mentioned, existing only to make somebody else's love story shine a little brighter by comparison. I looked around the table, Rosa laughing so hard she'd put her fork down, Marcus pretending not to enjoy himself and failing completely, Oliver mid-rant with a lemon tart in one hand, William watching all of it with the soft, unguarded face of a man who used to believe love had to be expensive to be real, and thought, with a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove still going behind me, "Not this time. This time, I got the whole book, and I intended to stay for every single chapter, most of them, if I'm honest, from a stool, with a glass of wine, gladly letting someone else do the dicing. If you made it all the way here, thank you, genuinely. Stories like this one only keep going because people stick around for them. If James and William talked you into us somewhere along the way, follow the channel so you don't miss the next one. See you Tuesday.